And just before we close down here on AMTV, a reminder you can help support the channel by joining the AMTV Patreon. You can also follow us and keep up to date on Twitter at AmTV, or if you like, you can join us here at AMTV by becoming a staff member via the YouTube membership program. The concept of 24-hour broadcasting in television almost seems like a given these days. Hundreds if not thousands of channels to choose from, all of them providing a constant stream of content for you to enjoy. But back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s and 80s, that was all merely a pipe dream. The reality was that the limited number of channels available were only broadcasting during certain hours of the day, often closing down around midnight, blasting out various arrangements of God Save the Queen to anyone who had decided to stay up, or those who'd fallen asleep with the telly still on. But in these off-air moments, or during moments of industrial action or technical problems, one image would become associated with these instances, one that in many ways went on to symbolise and represent the bygone era of television. So let's take a look at the lasting legacy of Test Card F. Test cards in television have been around since the early days. In the 1930s, a series of test patterns and tuning signals were used to let both engineers and the few audiences who possessed an early television set to adjust and tune the new machine to achieve the best looking picture. These patterns started extremely simple, with a circle and line being one of the first examples. The BBC would shut down its television service in September 1939 due to the outbreak of World War II. This would remain the case until the spring of 1946, when the corporation was finally able to pick up where it left off. With the relaunch of television, shortly after came the first introduction of a test card in a format we may recognise. Test Card A made its debut in 1947, and showcased how far already television had come in terms of its test designs. Bit more advanced than a circle and line, don't you think? Test Card B was developed shortly afterwards, but was reportedly never broadcast on the airwaves. Not that audiences would have noticed much difference. Aside from the lettering shifting to the top of the picture, the only new addition was an extra grayscale strip, seen below the centre circle. Presumably its use was strictly in-house by BBC engineers, though unfortunately the original Test Card B has been lost. For context, the first few iterations of test cards were physical props that were displayed by literally aiming a television camera at it, thus the pattern becoming the broadcast image. This would continue for some time, with electronically created test cards still some years away. 1948 would mark the debut of Test Card C, which presented a dramatically different structure to the two that came before it. This pattern might look somewhat familiar, as it's the first to contain the core structural elements of its more famous successor, but in its own right, Test Card C achieved an incredibly long life, lasting from 1948 up until Test Card D was issued to replace it in 1964. Similar to Test Cards A and B, not a great deal was changed with this new pattern. The main difference being that the lines used to test high-frequency responses were now more rectangular in nature, as opposed to the tower-like stacks of previous cards. Around the same time as Test Card D's introduction, in 1964, Test Card E was also developed, specifically to accommodate the new 625 line system that was introduced with the launch of BBC Two. Test Card D had been made to meet the then standard 405 line system, seen on the BBC and on the ITV network, so the introduction of a new variant seemed necessary for the new channel. However, depending on the sources that you read, Test Card E had one of the shortest on-air lifespans of any test card yet. Some claiming it lasted about a month before being altered, and others saying it was only transmitted for one day. Despite using the 625 line service, the original Test Card E didn't look any more impressive than its 405 line counterpart, as the frequency gratings hardly showcased the benefits of these newer, more advanced television sets. To manage this, Test Card E was quickly dropped in favour of a slightly altered version of the long-standing Test Card C, which would carry the BBC Two 625 line suffix until the introduction of colour in 1967. Meanwhile, BBC One would also use this altered version of Test Card E, with the channel logo displayed at the bottom until it too began transmitting in colour, and thus adopting the most recognisable test card of them all. George Hersee was born on the 29th of December 1924, and at the young age of 25 would join the BBC in its planning and installation department. A keen and talented engineer, George quickly showcased his prowess in the consistently evolving technological world of television, and by the end of the 1950s, he was specialising in lens and test card transparency specifications, becoming one of the standout leaders in said field. With the advent of colour television fast approaching in the UK, George and his team were tasked with developing the nation's first colour test card. This wouldn't be a simple case of tweaking previous iterations as seen with A to E. With colour TV came a whole array of new factors to take into account, none more major than the colour signal itself, and how it would appear on television sets. Coloured bars adorn Test Card F, providing a useful indicator to both television engineers as well as viewers at home as to whether the colour signal needed tuning or refining. However, the main addition that came with Test Card F would be the inclusion of a picture, right at the centre of the image. The image that you see here is what is synonymously associated with test cards generally, and it's the image of 8-year-old Carole Hersee and her toy clown Bubbles, playing a game of noughts and crosses. But how did Carole come to be used in this test card? And why? Born on the 25th of November, 1958, Carole Hersee was the daughter of George Hersee, the BBC engineer who was in charge of developing Test Card F. Furthermore, it was decided that the image of a child be included for two key reasons. One, so that engineers would be clearly able to tell if incorrect skin tones were present in the transmitted image, and another being that children were seen to be less subject to changing fashion and makeup trends, thus the image in some ways would be timeless.
The engineers realised that they needed facial colour because there weren't enough programmes going out because there were no daytime programmes.
George organised a photo shoot to capture images of both Carole and her younger sister Gillian, with Carole being chosen as her younger sibling was missing her front teeth at the time. The 8-year-old was paid £100 for the shoot, which might not sound like much today, but keep in mind that £100 in 1967 is almost £2,000 in 2021, when adjusted for inflation. On the technical side of things, the primary colours for TV were represented in full, the blue coming from the background, the red coming from Carole's outfit, and the green from her clown Bubbles. Bubbles himself was made by Carole as part of a kit set, but originally he sported a blue and white striped outfit. A green covering was made and sewn onto the clown in order to capture these crucial primary tones. Carole and Bubbles were first seen by viewers in the July of 1967, when BBC Two began transmitting in colour. The initial appearance of Test Card F didn't immediately cement how iconic it would become, with most viewers and engineers at the BBC believing it would only be around for about 6 months or so before a successor test card would be introduced. As the 60s rolled into the 70s, however, Test Card F continued to be viewed prominently by audiences. In these gaps between close down and startup, Test Card F would often be shown, very often with a selection of music. The choices in music were often quite calm and appeasing in nature, resulting in many leaving their TV switched on simply to enjoy what they heard, despite there not being any visual content to go with it. Besides the still image of Carole and Bubbles, of course. By the mid-70s, the phrase test card girl started to become more commonplace, in reference to Carole, and just the slide in general. It even started to enter popular culture. In 1973, you could buy a vinyl record that contained music inspired by what was heard on TV, and towards the end of the decade, in 1979, ITV's satirical series, End of Part 1, aired a spoof centred around the test card, in which auditions are held for a new test card girl.
Are you sure we can't get the original girl back?
Not a hope. She says she's getting typecast.
Also in 1979, Carole made an appearance on opinions-based programme Points of View. Now aged 21, she appeared within the test card to show viewers that she is now in fact all grown up.
It's 3 o'clock. Songs of Praise from Abbey Wood in southeast London is the next programme on BBC One, and that's at 3:15. In the meantime, we're returning to a trade test transmission.
The routine of the slide appearing during the day, when channels weren't on the air, would continue until the spring of 1983. Around this time, the BBC and ITV were looking to expand their broadcast hours, particularly with the launch of breakfast television. The BBC had Breakfast Time, which began on the 17th of February, with ITV's TV AM following 2 weeks later, on the 1st of March. The expansion of the schedules eventually resulted in changes and updates, one of which came with the relatively new and impressive technology of the day, CFAX. First launched in 1974, CFAX became the UK's first teletext-based service, allowing audiences to access information regarding upcoming programmes, as well as news, sport, and even the stock market. Despite a slow start, By the early 80s, more and more household TVs were equipped with CFAX, the many pages receiving more visits from curious viewers. Around this time, Pages from CFAX was launched. This was essentially a rolling feed of select pages from the service, transmitted as a regular TV picture, therefore viewable on any receiver, regardless of whether it was compatible with the service as a whole. Pages from CFAX would air in the absence of programming, and in the spring of 1983, it would begin to take up the daytime downtime that was normally occupied by Test Card F, shifting it from its settled spot after nearly 16 years. The stock library music remained, and now audiences could also read and catch up on the daily events rather than view a static image of a girl and her clown playing noughts and crosses. And as the televisual landscape continued to advance technologically during the 1980s, you'd be forgiven for thinking that perhaps Test Card F had finally reached the end of its natural life on air. Despite Pages from CFAX effectively replacing its slot during the daytime, Test Card F wasn't phased out completely. It could still be seen overnight and at the top of the morning, before the day's first programmes were transmitted, still with its signature complement of stock music. So even though you couldn't catch Carole and Bubbles during the daytime downtime, which itself was rapidly shrinking as schedules continued to expand, you could get up early to see them before you sat down for breakfast, or stay up late to catch them before bed. However, Test Card F wasn't limited to just being seen by audiences in the UK. In fact, the slide was in use in over 30 countries around the world, with notable examples including sections of Australia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and even Bahrain. Nations such as New Zealand and Singapore also used the Test Card F template, but would either replace the centre image or introduce other slight modifications. The Test Card Girl's mark in popular culture continued to grow and be utilised in the 1980s. One prime example was in the music video for Waiting for the Ghost Train by British group Madness. The beginning of the video shows the band's own version of Test Card F, dubbed Mad One Colour, complete with a parody of Carole and Bubbles. Carole herself, then in her early 30s, would go on to make an appearance in a documentary for the BBC's Arena series, Slim Gaillard's Civilization. The 4-part series aired in the autumn of 1989, and was predominantly focused on the life of the titular jazz musician. Carole would appear in short segments at the beginning and end of each episode, giving audiences a preview of what was to come, to recap them on the previous week's content, or to simply interact with Slim. A highlight for many was the way the short series concluded, in which Slim entered the TV screen, played a song for Carole about her fame as the Test Card Girl, before playing a round of noughts and crosses with her. But as the 90s came around, Test Card F's presence on terrestrial television was felt less and less. 24-hour broadcasting was properly beginning to take off, with many of the ITV regions now running continuously, though the 2 BBC channels were still closing down, albeit later and later with each passing year. 1992 was around the last year that Test Card F could be caught every day accompanied with music, and by the middle of the decade, it would stop being shown with music altogether, now only being seen accompanied by a test tone. Which, as intriguing as it is far less easy on the ears after a while than a good bit of stock music. However, the world was approaching a new millennium, a brand new age in entertainment and how audiences would consume it. In this vastly changing landscape, would Test Card F manage to survive the transition? In the November of 1997, BBC One would finally move to 24-hour broadcasts, even if the early morning hours were filled with rolling news coverage or programme previews. With this move, many believed that after over 30 years in service, Test Card F would not only be retired, but the entire format of the test card would be put away as well. As the world began slowly entering the digital age of television, the practical need for test cards began to seem more and more obsolete, particularly to the average viewer. Test Card F, which had been a staple signature of British television for well over 30 years, was finally retired, although the test card lineage was not gone for good. It's important to note that successors to Test Card F had existed long before the 1990s, but were seldom used or seen as much by comparison. Test Card G was first introduced back in 1971, itself a modified version of a design presented by Philips. It was the first electronically generated test card to be put into use by the BBC, but given the relative cost of the equipment used to generate it, Test Card F, which was transmitted via a slide scanner, was often used instead. And once the more famous variant itself started being transmitted electronically, Test Card G's appearances grew ever scarcer. Test Card H took a wildly different design, but was never seen by viewers. Its function was primarily for cameras in television studios to test various features, thus never being directly broadcast to the public. Feeling that the letter I was too similar in appearance to the numeral 1, The next couple of test cards, and arguably the true follow-ups to Test Card F, would arrive towards the end of the 20th century. The first of these, Test Card J, was a more straightforward update to its predecessor F, still showcasing the image of Carole and Bubbles in the centre, but now with a few new technical additions to better assist televisions of the 90s and the early 2000s. Finally, the new BBC corporate logo was lined across the bottom, clearly defining the era in which Test Card J was introduced to television viewers. The second newcomer was designated Test Card W. Wait, hang on, why are we jumping from J all the way to W?
But a few murmurings about the wacky camera angles and howls of outrage about the fact that the programme, along with 3 others on BBC One on Saturday night, was transmitted in widescreen, well, sort of widescreen.
Well, one exciting feature about newly made televisions of the day was the introduction and implementation of widescreen. Programming in this format became more commonplace as we entered into the 2000s, and newer televisions were better made to display the new picture format. In response, BBC engineers constructed Test Card W, namely standing for widescreen. This seemingly stretched out Test Card J was formatted to the 16:9 standard established by widescreen, and like Test Card J, contained a few new features to represent the modern age. However, despite the introduction of those 2 new cards, like the latter days of Test Card F, they would scarcely be seen by viewers, only appearing at the top of a day's broadcasting, or in increasingly rarer technical issues, with many channels now creating custom slides for moments of breakdown rather than rely on the test card. Even though these newcomers were labelled with different letters, the influence from the long-standing Test Card F was clear for all to see. Not only was the primary format and structure of the new cards very similar, but the continued use of Carole and Bubbles as the central image proves that not only does the photograph continue to work on a technical basis, but that timeless aspect I mentioned earlier was also starting to ring true. There's been one final revision of the BBC test card, unofficially known as Test Card X. First seen in 2007, not long after the introduction of the corporation's high-definition channel, BBC HD, the new card was very similar to Test Card W, though now presented in 1080 lines, thus becoming the first high-definition example of the BBC test card. And after over 40 years since first being seen by viewers, Carole and Bubbles remained as the centre focus of the new placeholder. The pair could be seen for a couple of hours every day, as part of BBC HD's preview slot, now complete with surround sound test tones. But with the closure of BBC HD in 2013, Test Card X would also be pulled from the airwaves, with no new iteration or new lettering of a BBC test card appearing since. The last 10 years have been a quiet time for Test Card F, or just test cards in general. Starting from the mid-2010s, a version of the widescreen variant could be seen every morning on BBC Two, at the end of the overnight This Is BBC Two preview segment. But aside from that, appearances of the classic Test Card F variety have been few and far between. However, in terms of its cultural impact, you could argue that the presence of Test Card F and its various successors couldn't be stronger. In the mid-noughties drama Life on Mars, the test card and a version of Carole herself appeared consistently, interacting with the series lead, Sam Tyler. More musical moments would follow, namely in the 2017 Gorillaz video for Hallelujah Money, and in countless amounts of merchandise. Mugs, badges, t-shirts, you name it, you can probably find it with Carole, Bubbles, and the familiar Test Card F structure printed onto it. For a time, you could even see a version of the image as an error message on the BBC website. But in regards to Carole Hersee, what does she herself think of this legacy, and just how it's impacted on her life over the past 50 years? Some sources claim that Carole initially was unhappy with her association with the test card, claiming it would get her bullied at school, or face the wrath of various teachers who simply didn't believe it was her.
How did it affect your life as an 8-year-old?
Well, other people at school didn't really believe me, so you had to take things in, or if there was been a newspaper article or something, I had to take the dress that I'd been wearing in, because they didn't believe you.
However, over the years she's been interviewed several times, often to celebrate the latest milestone of longevity that Test Card F has attained. In recent interviews, around the time of the card's 50th anniversary, she seems upbeat and positive regarding the impact her image has had on viewers across the generations. As the centre point of Test Card F, it's been estimated that she's been on viewers' screens for more than 70,000 hours, the equivalent to almost 8 continuous years, meaning Carole Hersee has arguably had more screen time than any other individual in the history of television. Quite a staggering claim for sure, but Carole continues to live life happily, working as a period costume designer and seamstress for several different productions in both stage and in film. although many still recognise her and will never forget the ever-present image of the test card girl. Test Card F to some may just appear to be like any other television test card out there, a series of coloured bars and grayscales that just happens to have a central image. But as we've seen, this particular test card broke boundaries. It was the first colour test card to be seen and used here in the UK, one that would set the benchmark for the next 30 years, despite successors and alternatives becoming available in that time. It introduced the world to Carole Hersee and her clown Bubbles, who would go on to be renowned figures amongst television enthusiasts. And perhaps most importantly, and significantly, it achieved one of its central aims in triumphant fashion, to create a central image that would truly last throughout the ages and generations. Even as Test Card F itself would be retired in the late 90s, the successors that followed would continue to not only embody the key structure of the long-standing template, but would also continue to use Carole and Bubbles as their main visual centerpiece, showing that despite all the changes and developments we've had over the last 50 years, the image of a child and her toy clown playing a game together remains both relatable and timeless to a whole new generation of television viewers.
Where am I?
You're everywhere.
Suppose I am, really.
Where's the little girl in the test card? The one with the little clown. She's seen all over the country, every city, every village, every town. When you turn on your TV, take a look and you will see the little girl in the test card. She's right here with me. She's playing noughts and crosses. She'll get you with a smile. It'll make your morning happy. Doubts in every child when you're getting ready for work or school or play. What a cute